All right. Thanks to all of you for joining us throughout the day and for joining us right now for this panel on structural racism in the criminal legal system. So as I've been able to see a lot of the symposium today, one of the things that struck me about the earlier panels and presentations is how interconnected all of these inequities in our systems and policies are, so that structural racism in housing, education, and other systems work in conjunction to funnel people of color into a criminal legal system that incarcerates more people than anywhere else on earth. And unfortunately, that's still true, and that is more focused on exerting control and perpetuating itself rather than creating a safer society. So we're extremely fortunate to have a panel of amazing attorneys and scholars who are all on the front lines of combating the structural racism in our system that leads to the criminalization of youth, adults, and poor people of color. What I'm going to do is very briefly introduce our speakers in order of presentation and tell you a little bit about their focus for today so you know where we're going. And then I'll do a more in-depth introduction just before each speaker presents. So first, we're going to have attorney Nia Weeks, who is the founder and executive director of Citizen She, and she'll be providing an overview of how the criminal legal system is built to function the way it does and how it affects people of color. Then Professor Kristin Henning, who is director of Georgetown Law's Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative and special advisor to the Dean on Community and Justice at Georgetown. And she will focus on the front end of the system, particularly on how the intersection of race, adolescence, and policing funnels Black and brown youth into the juvenile and criminal legal systems. And to close us out, our own Professor Andrea Armstrong will focus on the structural inequalities at the back end of the system around issues like sentencing, prison conditions, and reentry. I'm really looking forward to this, so we will get started as soon as I tell you a little bit more about our first speaker, Ms. Nia Weeks. Citizen She, the organization that she founded and now leads, is an advocacy organization building and enacting a collective policy agenda to address the needs of Black women in Louisiana. She is a New Orleans native. She's the former policy and advocacy director at Women with a Vision, which is another organization here in New Orleans that some of y'all might be familiar with. She's a Loyola skills instructor, and she has spent her entire career fighting for the rights of women, children, and families. She received her undergraduate degree from Indiana State University and is a Loyola Law alum. So Ms. Weeks, welcome back virtually, at least, to Loyola, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's always so good to be amongst family. Loyola is way more than just family. I had 4 children my entire tenure through law school, and Loyola loved me and my children that entire time, even making sure we had Christmas presents every year. Professor Armstrong, I don't know if you all really understand what a gem this person is, but I was her law clerk, and we have shared law clerks since I've been out. We share system advocacy, even when we don't talk every day. We're still in the same circle. And Kristin, just dope sister. Y'all lucky today. Let me just tell you, y'all so lucky today, and we're a family. So I'm gonna do my PowerPoint in just a second, but I just want to center. We're talking about racial injustice and gender injustice. And those of you that have gotten through their first semester with con law, we know the first 3 words of the Constitution, we the people. Most of us were not people, right? And even though the Constitution has continuously had to correct itself to try to include those of us that it didn't think of as people into receiving citizenship, we know that there's caveats that actually do allow discrimination, right? And so even though it's strict scrutiny, rational basis, and intermediate basis, even though all that exists, there's still the ability to be discriminatory. And so when we think about the systems that are melded under that, they're all centered around a space where the majority of the people who are citizens here were not considered citizens when the Constitution was enacted. And so when you think about disseminating racism, disseminating all of these spaces, You got to start from the bottom up. So I am going to start with my portion of this discussion. I'm sharing my screen. I call this detangling the criminal justice system. And actually, I really am proud of this project also because my law clerks from Loyola helped me put together most of these presentations and have also presented this work as well. So let's get started with a video.
The age of 18 is when I got my first felony conviction, and the laws in Louisiana was that if you were convicted felon, you couldn't vote.
I have not been able to vote because of a felony that I got over 10 years ago.
I never classified myself as being a criminal. I never classified myself as, doing something wrong. I got a felon because of just holding a conversation.
As a youth organizer and teaching just how important it was to vote. I never thought that I would lose my voting rights. In the early 2000s, I was arrested trying to defend myself against a police officer. The judge found me guilty of assault on a public servant and sentenced me to 10 years in prison because I had people from the community who let the judge know the type of person I am, the work that I've done, my whole life. And that's what made him give me the sentence of 4 months and 6 years of shock probation.
I feel kind of like I'm in purgatory. I feel like it's like a time warp where you're taking me back to this time where I'm being punished for something, a mistake that I made when I was 23 years old. And here I am, 41, and I'm still being punished for that.
The felons voting bill. For 3 years, I fought compromising. They actually wanted me to change the bill so that it would look at people who committed certain crimes and not let them vote. And I refused to do that. The Republicans were getting messages from the outside. Don't pass this bill, they'll all be Democrats. Why should we do this? Because felons can be put on jurors. And they realize that a lot of these folks who are getting these harsh sentences of long-term parole are African Americans.
I think it has a lot to do, with me being Black and poor and just being someone that people want to write off.
I guess this great state, have a problem with, LGBTQ people, or especially trans. I can remember, tall, very attractive guy in an unmarked police car. He stopped me, we was talking and things like that. It was about 5 or 10 minutes. He just put his hands in his pocket and then he said, "You're under arrest." And I'm like, "For what?" So that's when I knew about the crime against nature charge.
That's a antiquated law that's been around for about 200 or something years that has truly been the bane of a lot of my community members' existence, with trans women getting arrested one time and doing 20 years.
If you plead guilty or found guilty, then you was required to register as a sex offender. Just in the city itself, they had like over 800 people on the sex offender registry because of talking crime. I've never realized that voting was important until now.
Recently, Wendy has taken on this campaign and she's gathered a whole bunch of us together to try to get rid of the law. I try to lend my voice in different ways, but unfortunately, I am not able to vote.
Even though we just got a bill passed that now allows convicted felons to vote, I still don't fall in that bracket. I still cannot vote. You would have to be off of probation or parole 5 years before you're eligible to vote again. I'm working with Vote, Voice of the Experience, and we are working to restore voting rights. So Vote filed a lawsuit against the state of Louisiana because convicted felons was never even supposed to lose their right to vote. If we win that lawsuit, I'll be able to immediately vote, right away. So
after my release, which was April 12, 2012, I wanted more. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to be more involved. I wanted to fight for the people I left, the women that I left in prison. At the age of 43, I voted for the first time. I voted for Latoya for city council. Fast forward, I voted for her in the mayoral race. My vote counted.
The most important thing was to give these individuals who are on probation or parole the opportunity to vote before they die. We're not through. We've got to be sure that women were able to take part in all of the criminal justice reform measures. And one of the most serious issues is that reentry programs for men were climbing. Reentry programs for women was very, far and few between in the state of Louisiana.
My reentry was not a successful one. I was homeless. I could not find employment my first 90 days out. I didn't have any clothing. I didn't have my own underwear. And so society believes that, well, you know, you get out, your family is going to ensure that. Well, my family was in poverty when I left. And my family was in poverty when I returned. I just knew women were in prison and nobody's talking about it.
Even if they committed an infraction and are behind bars, we've got to be very cognizant about the fact that, you know, these women do need us, that, you know, we need to make sure that they've got the right tools, the right resources, the right education going on for them. We've got to just make sure that they're protected. We've got to be the voice that makes the difference. And if we're the voice that makes the difference, then we can move mountains.
That's real. So as we're having these discussions, especially today, and we're talking about the criminal justice system, and we're talking about systemic racism, and we're talking about the issues that people navigate through, we have to remember at the center and at the core, we're talking about people. These are not numbers. These are not just statistics. These are not just cases in a case book. These are human beings whose lives are impacted. And so I really wanted to center for you all and have it resonate with you all that everything you heard today and everything that you will hear moving forward, every case that you read, every case that you study, you're talking about human beings. You're talking about their lives being impacted. And we're talking about the criminal justice system. We're talking about the idea of removing someone's liberty. And let that sink in for just a second. What does it mean to remove someone's liberty? It means that you're disallowing someone to move freely in this world. And so the ability to do that, the standard, the ceiling for that should be so high that we're taking away someone's freedom. And the reality is that in this country, you know, we are only 5% of the entire population of the world, 5%. But we hold 25% of the incarcerated population in the entire world. We also know that in Louisiana, we hold the highest number. I think we're number 2. Professor Armstrong, am I right? Are we now number 2? But we're in the top 1 to remove. We oscillate between 1 and 2 of incarcerated persons in the entire world, specifically New Orleans, and just reiterating that 75% of the people incarcerated in New Orleans are pre-adjudication, means that they've only been accused of a crime, not convicted. So there's a reality, and the reason why, you know, we talk about voting in that aspect in that initial video when it comes to incarcerated persons is that there is a reality that by the time a case reaches a defense attorney's hands, every single person who has touched it is an elected official. And the ability to impact how those elected officials think and move and interact and expect us to react and interact with one another, if it's rooted in racist and sexist and bigoted ideology, right? Then every single person that's touched this person's desire for liberty has the ability to make policy around how they move, right? And when we think about what policy actually is, right? Policy is not a whole bunch of like rudiment. Getting there is a process, but where it starts is an idea. It's an idea that this is how people, or this group of people, or people in general, should move, react, and interact with one another. Excuse me, swallowed wrong. How people should react and interact with one another, and then creating guidelines on how that effectuates. And so if every single person that has a determination of whether or not this person has the right to be free or have their liberty and their ability to navigate society taken away as an elected official, then those who are consistently incarcerated especially when we know that incarceration is centered around racism, sexism, and bigotry. If every single person who touches it, an elected official, then we have the right to, and they have the right to impact those decision-making processes. So let's talk about who the system players are.
The district attorney is one of the most powerful people in this city.
They're the linchpin to hold a case together, to build a case, to decide what to do with the case. It's up to the district attorney whether to just dismiss a case altogether.
There's insiders and there's outsiders. The insiders are prosecutors, the judges, sheriffs, and the outsiders are the crime victims, the mamas, the papas, witnesses, the criminal defendants, the formerly incarcerated. And the insiders want to make sure that those outsiders do not understand the system.
African American women in New Orleans are the most impacted by the criminal justice system, whether they're dealing with it as a mother, a wife, or a child. Our system is comprised of a lot of African American males, and which adds an extra burden to the females that remain out here in society.
So that is true, right? That there are a bunch of different decision makers within the space, and like we said, they're all elected officials. So let's start with like even the law that people are said to have broken, right? Who writes those laws? Our legislators, right? Right now, if we decide that we want to come up with a law that has impact on how community moves, we go to our lawmakers and we ask them to write a bill and we push that bill through. So there's the law, and those are elected officials. Then who decides, what laws are important? Well, it's the chief of police, right? They're the one that instruct how the officers move. Who chooses the chief of police? The mayor, right? So the city makes a determination on who that person is, and that person makes a determination on how the laws that the legislators have enacted, who gets arrested for what, and what's the priority for that. Then we move to housing, right? And we're talking about New Orleans specifically. And housing, who makes the decision on what programs are available, how people are housed, whether or not the respect that people are given or not given. Who makes that determination? The sheriff. And you vote on your sheriff every 4 years. So that's another person. Then they go before a judge. And the judge makes a determination on bail, whether or not to enact bail, what kind of bail that is. That's another elected official, right? It's the judge. Then we move on to the person navigating the case through court, the most powerful person in the courtroom, because statutorily they can move in ways that the other system actors cannot, and that is the district attorney. And so I'm going to give us like a little bit of an overview of the role of the district attorney because of the power that that person enacts. Also, that is another elected official. So move on. So let's talk about what the heck does the DA do? Of all the state actors, the district attorney is the most powerful person in that equation, right? The DAs have the most knowledge of the facts of the case. They get what's called a gist, right? So someone comes in, they're arrested, they go for arraignment, which was, and the judge decides whether or not there's enough evidence to hold them, what their bond is. Who holds that file? It's the prosecutor. So the prosecutors read that file way before the public defender even touches it, right? Has talked to potential complaining witnesses. They know all the things, and they make their own legal conclusion based on those facts. And then everybody else gets informed. Then the defense attorney gets informed after the prosecutor has navigated it through. Then the judge gets informed. But the DA is the one that knows most, and they use those facts to decide if they will prosecute that case or not, right? And so a judge can say, bro, you ain't got enough evidence to like hold them on this, and the prosecutor can say, okay, cool, but I'm still gonna move forward, right? The judge has the ability to say they don't get a bond or what have you, but whether or not the case gets prosecuted, whether or not something moves forward, if someone is offered diversion, whatever it is, however it is, with the DA is the one that makes that determination, right? The DA has the ability to offer diversion, right? And we always talk about like other ways that the system can navigate without holding people in jail, and diversion is one of them. But the person that has the ability to offer diversion is the DA. The judge can agree, but the judge can't say you have to offer diversion. That is solely the DA's ability to choose. And so if the DA is coming through a lens of racism, sexism, and bigotry, and the DA decides, you know what, I'm just not gonna do no diversion programs for women. You know what, I'm cool. I don't think that trans community, you know, I'm just not gonna, and they can do that arbitrarily. They don't have to explain who, what, when, where, why, or how. They don't have to explain whether or not they're gonna offer a deal. They don't have to explain, you know, why they move the way they move. They just get to move, right? And that's why, you know, why I say there's so much power in that role. If I don't like something a judge says, I used to be a public defender. If I didn't like what a judge said, I'm like, Judge, I'm taking out a writ. And I have other judges look at what this judge has determined. But for the DA, there's no space, right, that he has to adhere to outside of what we all have to adhere to when it comes to ethics, when it comes to our, you know, navigating the case. But if the DA is allowed to offer or not offer diversion and not required to, then they can choose arbitrarily how they move those cases. They can also choose if it's free or if it costs money, right, to do those diversion programs. So all of that impacts people who are coming through a system. And we know that in New Orleans, 85% of the people who navigate through criminal court are poor. They qualify for a public defender, which means economically, they're disadvantaged in a way that allows them to access the right to a free attorney, right? 85%. So the majority of people who are coming through court cannot access the diversion program if it costs too much money. And so it forces them to navigate a system that's arbitrarily decided by somebody who may or may not have discriminatory ideology about who they are, and there's no protection of them from that part of the system that ensures that everybody who goes through the system has equal treatment. So we live, like I said, we live in the most incarcerated state in the most incarcerated country in the world. Black people constitute 33% of the residents in this state, but make up 52% of the people in jail and 52% of the prison population, meaning 1 in every 86 adults are entangled in the criminal legal system, right? And we know that, and as we stated, we heard the women state earlier, the reality is that when one person goes to jail, everybody goes to jail. Everybody's family is impacted in some way. Everyone's hearts and minds are impacted in some kind of way. You know, if I were arrested today and I were to go before a judge, and if my bond is over $5,000, I don't have in my account just open enough money to cover my bond. So I would sit. I'm also a single mother of 4. So something would have to happen to my children. If I got arrested on the 31st and I know my rent is due on the 1st and I'm not able to get out and I live in a space where I have to, you know, I don't have that leeway with my landlord, then I can get evicted like that. If I am working shift work and my boss needs me at work at 5 o'clock and I miss work because I've been arrested, I lose my job, right? And everything that comes along with any of those things falls along with it. And so the impact on poor people, when poor people are arrested, when women are arrested, when children are arrested, the ripple effect, the impact permeates everywhere and everyone. And then you move desperate people who are already poor into desperate situations where the only way that they can find some semblance of freedom, some semblance of equity is if they buy their way through. And they don't have the money. So then what happens is that we think, well, you know what? I gotta make this money because if I don't pay these fines and fees, if I don't take care of all the things, if I don't get the diversion and able to go to work, then I'm gonna lose everything. So, hey, maybe I do have to do something to ensure that I can get those dollars so I can ensure that I can still maintain some semblance of life. And so the collateral consequences pile on top of each other and make it so that even though we are the most incarcerated state in the most incarcerated city in the entire world, we are not the safest place in the entire world. So something has to be wrong with the system if we incarcerate everybody, if we making sure that we are, pulling people in and robbing them of their liberties, but we're still not safe. We're still not economically sound. We still have the majority of our community navigating with PTSD. We are doing something wrong. And so I'm gonna show these last two videos, and then I'm gonna move on to the next speaker, but these are showing some of the collateral consequences of incarceration on some of my people that I've loved, clients and friends.
When we talk about health and economics and criminal justice reform, all these issues, we tend to talk about them as separate issues, but they're not. My entire time spent in prison was for shoplifting, right? Which is so-called survival crimes, right? I was drug addicted. The drug addiction came from years of suppressing trauma, right? There was no mental health resources available to me. So I carried those traumas as a young Black woman who didn't have a lot of resources available to her, who was raised in poverty, who began to have kids that she couldn't take care of because of the economics. Who ended up in prison. You follow me? The health, the economics, criminal justice, right? Black women have suffered not only at the hands of society, but at our own hands.
What do we need to pay attention to? One of the things I think we need to pay attention to is that there is a stigma attached to mental health, right? Or mental health issues. And I think we as Black women have an important role to play in helping to break through those stigma and break them down and understand that vulnerability, being vulnerable and understanding emotional health is actually courageous. It's actually about being strong rather than being weak. And I think for us as Black women too, there are stereotypes that exist that, we have to be strong all the time. So I think breaking through those stigmas and being able to express that it's important for us to acknowledge that the whole person, the healthy person, includes mental health care. It includes taking care of emotional health. And then if we are able to address that, then, we help to make our communities healthier overall.
I have a 3-year-old daughter named Liberty Promise Blessing. August 16, 2018, my daughter's father was killed. Just knowing that my daughter will never get to have her father throughout the rest of her life, and I have to explain the loss. She's so young to say what the outcome can be, but I'm firstly thinking about her safety. I'm also thinking about when things come up as in maybe a father-daughter dance or things where she needs someone to be there present, or her father just being a protector for her, she won't have it. We realize the mental strain that is putting on the child or the effects of the child in the long run. What resources are available? I don't want Liberty father being killed to just be a tragic. I want to use that story to advocate for just mental health services, knowing that it's okay to go talk to somebody or to just maintain a livable life, like a healthy life. I know that my vote may not change things immediately, but I hope eventually it may help a family like mine.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and pass on to the next presenter. Thank y'all so much for listening.
Thank you. I think that puts a lot of things in perspective that, you know, I think some of us might know, but we don't think about it, you know, as much as we should. The next presenter is my friend and mentor, Professor Chris Henning. It is really, really hard to overstate Professor Henning's influence in the field of juvenile justice, not just as a scholar, but as an attorney, an advocate, a trainer of juvenile defenders. It's also hard to overstate her influence on my professional development personally. Wouldn't be probably a clinical professor and wouldn't be the juvenile defender I am today without her. So if you take my clinic, you will be reading some of her numerous articles on race and adolescence. And in addition to, you know, the scholarship, she has done so much. I talked about her roles at Georgetown, but she is also the director of the Atlantic Juvenile Defender Center. She's developed some amazing national resources and training programs, ambassadors for racial justice. There's a toolkit, NJDC, the National Juvenile Defender Center, published called a Racial Justice Toolkit for Youth Advocates, and something that I'm a part of, the Juvenile Training Immersion Program that trains juvenile defenders from around the country. And so she, you know, some of the other stats are, she received her JD from Yale Law School, has an LLM from Georgetown. She was the juvenile unit head for the DC Public Defender's Service. And I'm just so excited to be able to introduce Professor Kristin Henning to all of you.
I am beyond honored to be here exactly with my friend, Hector Linares, truly, truly one of just my heroes. And then to be in this space with these powerful women, Nia Weeks and Andrea Armstrong, I am very, very happy to be here. So let me set up my PowerPoint as well. You know, we all gotta have that to guide the flow. So just indulge me for a second. I'm gonna put myself into presenter mode. Now, my question for you all, I'm gonna ask Hector to let me know, can you see my slides or can you see my notes?
I see just your slides.
Okay, excellent. That's where we wanna be. All right, so let me jump right in. I think Nia has done an awesome job of giving us an overview of how race impacts every stage of the criminal justice system, all the decision makers. And she's absolutely right that every player in the system has a role to play in perpetuating the racism throughout the system. All right. So what I want to do for my sort of 20 minutes with you is I want to draw your attention to the front end of the system. And I want to focus on police officers, and I want to focus on the intersection of policing, race, and adolescence. Our country's obsession with the over-policing and mass incarceration of Black and Brown America starts with children, okay? So I also wholeheartedly agree with Nia's approach that we have to talk about these questions from the lens of real people, right? Blood and sweat, and not abstract theory. So I think the best way for me to bring this home for you is to draw upon the lived experience of one teenager that I represented with my law students at Georgetown Law School in Washington, DC. So we're gonna call this young man Andre, all right? So Andre was a 15-year-old Black boy who was walking down the street with a friend. There was no report of crime, and the boys weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. They weren't loud, they weren't smoking, they weren't drinking, yet the police drove up to them and asked them if they had heard any gunshots. When the boys said no, the police asked them, well, show me your waist. And both boys complied by lifting their shirts. Unfortunately, the officers still were not satisfied and asked the boys for permission to conduct a full search, at which point either Andre or his friend, one of them, says yes. 4 uniformed officers jump out of their police car, force the boys against the wall, and frisk them. So I want to stop the story right there before I add any additional details, because there is so incredibly much to unpack in that story. The first question that we should unpack is, why is it that Andre was stopped in the first place, right? The officers' requests were clearly laden with racially biased assumptions about who these boys were, what they were up to, and the police officers themselves later acknowledged that there had in fact been no gunshots. They conceded that they had no specific reason to believe that Andre or his friend had any contraband, but instead they remained adamant that the boys, quote unquote, voluntarily agreed to be searched. All right, so we're going to come back to that in a second. But for now, the critical point is that these officers had absolutely no reason to stop these boys other than racial profiling. All right, so let's think for a moment about how pervasive this is. So we can think about Tamir Rice and remember what the police officers said in their explanation for why they shot Tamir, right? So, oops, I'm sorry. So they, of course, they said that they received the radio call for a black male with a weapon, probably fake, all right? But they also kept focusing on Tamir's size, saying that he looked much older than this 12-year-old face, beautiful face that we see here. They focused on the fact that he was weighing 170 pounds, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall, wearing a size 36 pants and a man's extra large jacket. So apparently the police officers could not see this beautiful baby face that we see here. And the reality is people are afraid, are uniquely afraid of Black boys in particular, and women, Black girls, boys and girls in our country. And Tamir is absolutely not alone. Research by Philip Atiba Goff, which is one of the researchers that Professor Carbado referenced in his keynote, but Philip Atiba Goff and his colleagues conducted research demonstrating that the public and the law enforcement officers often perceive Black boys to be 4.53 and 4.59 years older than they actually are. That research also shows that Black youth are more likely to be dehumanized. In other words, more likely to be associated with an ape, right? And that they are more likely to be perceived as culpable for criminal behavior than either white or Latinx youth, right? What's really frightening, and one of the most disturbing studies that I have read, is that researchers have found that people are also more likely to mistakenly believe that a child as young as 5 years old, let's be clear, a Black child as young as 5 years old is holding a weapon instead of a toy like a baby's rattle, right? So our traditional Western notions of childhood innocence are thrown out of the window when Black children are involved, right? Because they are completely dehumanized and not seen as children at all. And that is why children like Andre are stopped by the police. So let's go back. This is a second layer of the story that we want to unpack about Andre. And the question that I want to ask here is, why did Andre, quote unquote, consent or agree to be searched by the officers? Why did he agree to lift his shirt and be searched? So we have to think about how frequently Black youth are exposed to police officers, either through the media, the internet, school, on the streets, in their homes. And the current reality is that policing in Black America, including the high-profile killings that they all see on the internet and on television, and the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, have cultivated a generation or socialized a generation of Black and brown youth to be terrified of the police and to do whatever they have to do to get home safely, right? So he consented, right? And let me also be clear, that fear that they have is not at all irrational. I wanted to share with you, there are 2 studies that came out just in the last few months showing that young people in general are more likely than adults to be shot and killed by the police, but specifically Black youth in particular are 6 times more likely to be shot to death than their white peers. But that is only part of the story. Yes, Andre complied because he was afraid of police violence, but he also complied because that is just a part of the dance that Black and brown children have learned to do with the police in cities like Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. They know that if they don't comply, their flight from the police, their running from the police, and their resistance will just be used against them, right? By the police to confirm that, oh yeah, indeed, they're up to no good and that they are suspicious, right? So imagine what it must be like to be a child, right? The work of managing these day-to-day contacts with police officers is exhausting for anyone, but even more so for a teenager who is naturally impulsive, reactive. They care a lot about what their friends see and think about them. Although they are inexperienced in the law and their legal rights, they still care a lot about fairness and they are outraged by justice. So you can just imagine how difficult it is for a young person to navigate these police encounters. Sometimes they comply, like Andre did, just to avoid the hassle and the risk of it all. But sometimes they do run. Sometimes they do talk back. Sometimes they do resist because they are teenagers, and that is what teenagers do. But then what happens, right? They get arrested. Black and brown kids get arrested for being rude, giving attitude, not submitting to an officer's quote unquote authority. They get arrested for basically being what we call in contempt of cops, which is camouflage in charges like resisting arrest, threats, or assault on a police officer, when really what they are doing is just engaging or being normal adolescents and having normal adolescent responses. All right, but let's go back to Andre one more time. And let me add one more detail to the story. What if I told you that the police found a gun on Andre? So now most of you all are thinking, well, at least we got one gun off the street, right? But let's think about the impact of this encounter on the hundreds of kids who are stopped every day without being involved in any criminal behavior, including Andre's friend who was there. And let's remember that in Black and brown communities where most police encounters with young people occur outside in public view, almost every negative encounter is witnessed by several other young people who go home, tell their friends, tell their family, or post it on social media, right? So this is the context in which we are dealing with. So the question that we begin to ask ourselves is it worth it? The data shows that the vast majority of people who are stopped never have weapons or any other contrabands whatsoever. So many of you have heard about the data from back in 2011 from New York showing that out of 689,000 police officers stopped in New York City, contraband was recovered in only 2% of those encounters. And of course, the vast majority of those stops involve Black and Latinx people. But that is true all over the country. And so just to give you a more recent snapshot of police stops involving teenagers in Washington, D.C., where Andre was, in a 30-day window in the summer of 2019, there were 412 young people stopped in that window. Of those young people stopped, 96% were Black and brown. And in those encounters, a gun was found in only 4 of those stops. Drugs were found in only 1 of those stops. That's out of 412. So at the end of the day, we are willing to traumatize 407 youth to get 4 guns off the streets. And so this trauma piece, though, I really want to sit here for 1 second. The trauma piece cannot be ignored. And you heard the sister in Nia Weeks's video talking about this trauma. So guess what the research shows? There is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing imposes on Black and brown youth in one of the most important times of their lives. Studies show that Black youth who have been the target of excessive police stops by the police report high rates of fear, anxiety, distress, depression, hopelessness. They become vigilant, and sensitive to perceived threats. And by that, I just mean they're always on guard, right? They're always distrusting police officers. And guess what? That distrust transfers from police officers to other state actors, right? Like teachers, probation officers, and the like. And so this is something we really have to factor when we decide about the policies and the practices of policing. What is also so powerful about this research is that trauma trauma occurs not only from being the direct target of police aggression, but also from witnessing or hearing about police aggression from family, friends, and even from people that we don't know about. So how many of you all watched George Floyd killed on national television, right? Imagine that, right? Watching that, if you're a Black or brown child who's grown up seeing that every day, and that you walk outside your door and you see police officers on every street corner. The research shows that just having to worry about becoming the victim of police violence is in and of itself a stressor that produces the same kinds of symptoms that I talked about in the last slide. Research also shows that youth who report these types of constant police stops have a significantly greater odds of poor sleep quality and sleep deprivation altogether, which we all know leads to poor ability to focus in the classroom, and inability to excel day to day in the classroom and in their daily lives. All right. So one other thing I want to say about the research, and then I'm going to drive us to what I think we should do about it, right? It's really important to understand that these over-policing strategies affect teenagers' perceptions of themselves and of law enforcement. So degrading and dehumanizing encounters with the police undermine a young person's beliefs about who they are, who they can become in life, and whether it is even worth it to participate and abide by the rules of mainstream societies. These encounters undermine adolescent perceptions about the fairness and the legitimacy of police officers in America. This is a cost, right? This is a cost of that stop and frisk practice. And I'm going to, in my last final point I want to make about the traumatic effects of policing is to highlight something that I think we all know, which is that extended periods of psychological trauma and chronic stress that I've been talking about and that Nia talked about in her presentation, or had the women talk about in her presentation, leads to poor physical long-term health outcomes, cognitive impairments, high blood pressure, heart attacks, early death, right, have all been associated with stress and fears that arise from these traumatic encounters like policing. So at the end of the day, it is far from clear that recovering Andre's gun improved our public safety enough to outweigh the harm done to racial equity, fundamental privacy, community respect for law enforcement, and the psychological well-being of all Black and brown youth. At the end of the day, kids aren't safer, police aren't safer, the public is not safer through these strategies, these over-policing and over-criminalization of Black youth and brown youth. So what do we do about it? I think I like to always say that our reform efforts should fall into three broad categories. The first of which is we have to radically reduce the footprint of police officers in the lives of Black and brown youth, right? So that means police-free schools. That means decriminalizing normal adolescent behaviors, right? Like disturbing schools and disorderly conduct, things like that. We have to figure out ways, and there are ways, to reduce the unnecessary stop and frisk of Black and brown youth. We also, as a second bucket, have to invest in alternatives to police intervention, right? So adopting a public health approach to really, quite frankly, what is often just normal adolescent misbehaviors, right? We have to invest in youth directly and not in police officers and in hardware like security equipment at the front door of the public school system. And then in the third bucket, when we find that police have to engage with young people, then we need to ensure that that engagement is developmentally appropriate. That means training officers on adolescent development and on best practices for working with young people, limiting the use of force when children are involved. First of all, when all people are involved, but especially, there's no excuse when young people are involved, requiring de-escalation strategies that any good parent knows, that any good teacher knows, that any good mental health expert knows. Law enforcement need to adopt these strategies, and we need to prohibit things like consent searches, so-called consent searches, like Andre saying, okay, yes, you can search me, because there's no way in which any Black or brown child in today's society can knowingly and voluntarily consent to a police officer who says, hey, can I search you? So let me end by saying, look, in the time that I have with you, we can't talk about all of these solutions in detail, but I do, for many of you students who are thinking about where you can enter in the reform conversation, I want to just say a word about the police-free schools movement. I hope this is some shock and awe data, showing how many young people in today's society are experiencing trauma, yet we are persistent in having schools with more police officers than we do counselors. It's a powerful, powerful study from the ACLU in 2019 showing that there are 1.7 million students who attend school with police officers, but no school counselors. 6 million students attend schools with police officers and no school psychologists. 10 million students attend schools with police officers, but no school social worker. This is shameful, especially in light of evidence, or actually, especially in light of the fact that there is little or no evidence in the empirical research showing that police presence in schools has prevented crime or improved safety on campus. And in fact, there's even less evidence showing that SROs, school resource officers, can prevent the kind of high profile school shootings that they were quote unquote sent to schools to prevent. As most of you know, police officers were actually present in places like Columbine and Parkland, and they weren't able to prevent those shootings. And what's worse is that we persist in sending police to schools despite clear evidence that school resource officers actually harm and undermine student well-being and performance. Police officers in schools or on campus have been associated with poor attendance and lost instruction time, increased dropout rates, poor academic achievement, increased trauma that I've already talked about, physical abuse. We all saw one of the most well-known examples of children of Shakira Murphy from South Carolina, Spring Valley being yanked out of her chair, kids in Chicago being dragged down the stairwell by school resource officers, and of course, increased police involvement. So we are at a moment, I'm hopeful, we are at a moment for reform. And since the killing of George Floyd, since June of 2020, a number of cities have voted to remove police from schools in some form or another. And instead, they are reallocating or reinvesting that money in alternative strategies that are attentive to mental health needs. So social workers, counselors, community violence interrupters, mental health professionals, what they call credible messengers, more libraries. Research is fascinating. More libraries actually reduces crime in schools. Smaller class sizes reduce crime in school. So we can be imaginative. We can break through this. So I will end there. I look forward to your questions and comments as we go. And I look forward to hearing from Professor Armstrong.
Y'all heard Professor Henning call me her hero, right? I just want that. That's recorded now. So.
I stand by that, stand by it.
All right, so moving on, we are so fortunate here at Loyola to have our own in-house leading national expert on these issues of prison and jail conditions. And I'm not going to go into all the bio to give Professor Armstrong all the time she can to speak, but I do want to mention her really innovative incarceration seminar and the project that came out of it, where she partnered with the Law and Technology Clinic to develop a website, incarcerationtransparency.org. So she's not just a scholar and academic. She is involved here in the New Orleans community on these issues and nationally in other ways as well that really make an impact. So Professor Armstrong, take it away.
Thank you so much. So this has just been, I've been sitting here, taking all the notes. Really proud of our symposium students and Melia and Jillian, I know, and with Brian Huddleston Brian Huddleston's not in the law review, but he's been helping them. And this project today has sparked so many conversations. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our students and our staff and our faculty for all pulling this together. Besides, I get to be on a panel with Nia Weeks and Kristin Henning, so that'll just make me happy anytime. It should not be revolutionary to have 3 Black female experts on a given topic speak at the same time. I want to thank the law review students for recognizing that fact and for building out a program where we can hear from experts with a variety of experiences and perspectives. So a lot of y'all know me. I hope my students who are here from Concrim Pro were taking all the notes during Professor Henning's thing. We were talking about consent and all the exceptions. I'm coming at this differently, right? And so Nia helped us understand how important this stuff is and where the impact is and the role of decision makers, right? Professor Henning helped us understand the role of policing in a large sense, how Concrim Pro plays a role in this, but also focusing in on adolescents. I'm doing something a little bit different, right? So I'm coming more at the back end of the system. A person has been searched, they have been arrested, they have been convicted, likely through pleading, right? Because only 2% of criminal trials are actually a trial with a verdict, right? Otherwise, it's just pleading. I'm coming after all of that. And what we often see missing from the law school curriculum is a discussion of, okay, well, what happens for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 life years that a person spends behind bars? And my research of my work is exclusively on how the Constitution and how the law works behind bars. And so there's just so much that I want to share with y'all. So I made a little PowerPoint to limit myself to 2 topics because there are so many ways that we could talk about conditions and race and structural racism in particular. And thinking about solitary confinement and implicit bias. There's just so many things. So I'm only going to talk about 2. But it's a rich field. So let me, here I go with my fancy sharing. There we go. All right. So I'm going to start out with just a little bit of an overview about prisons, right? We don't know a lot about prisons, and that is by design, not a defect. Then I'm going to go through some objectively neutral rules and show you the disproportionate impact that we have. And again, these are things that are actually quite difficult to find out, both in terms of data as well as in terms of what the actual policies are. Again, I don't think that that is a bug in the system. I think that is how the system was designed to function. And then last, I want to conclude with thinking about how do we make these things better, right? How do we ruin fewer lives? Might be one way of framing it. That's kind of the reform angle. How do we, hurt fewer people? But I think the abolition angle is how do we then build robust and strong systems that uplift human dignity, right? And also accountability, and also the equality that each person deserves just by virtue of being born a human soul. And so let's start with prisons generally. So, there are 2 different types of carceral facilities that I'm talking about in this presentation, right? So the death data project that Professor Linares mentioned, that actually looks at deaths that happen anywhere that there are bars, whether it's immigration detention, federal prison, youth detention, secure care versus non-secure care, jails and prisons. But for now, I just want to focus on 2 types, and that's prisons and jails. Prisons are usually where someone is going to be serving their sentence, right? It is after that they have been convicted, and those are traditionally operated by the state. Jails, on the other hand, are usually going to be for people who are pre-trial, meaning they have not been convicted or found innocent, right? That's exactly the thing. We haven't figured it out yet. And so they are just there pending a resolution of their charges and of the charges that are being held against them. Sometimes you'll have people who are doing their misdemeanor sentence in a jail. Misdemeanor sentences tend to be, at least in our jurisdiction, a year or less. I know it differs a little bit, but it's usually smaller. And usually our jails are operated by your local authority, right? So if you're mad about a prison, you go to the executive branch of your state. If you're mad about a jail, you go to the executive branch of your city or parish. The reason I bring this up is because prisons and jails perform very different functions, and they are designed to perform different functions. So prisons are for long-term stays, right? Prisons, and so they might have more robust medical care, for example, right? Because you're going to be there from age 30 until age 80. And that healthcare system is the only healthcare system that you get. So they have to be cognizant of a range of types of conditions, more robust programming in terms of education or vocational work. Jails are designed for short-term stays. Jails are designed for in and out. Someone comes in, their charges are dealt with, they may post bail or bond, they may be released on their own recognizance, they go home, right? This is important because Louisiana is kind of different, right? We are relatively unique. Only Kentucky does it like we do. And what it is we put about half of our prison population, these are people who have been convicted, we put them and house them in jails. And what that means is for that half of the population, they have less access to vocational programming, educational programming. Often they are at a distance from their family because the 130 facilities that we have in the state of Louisiana, let me repeat that, 130 facilities in the state of Louisiana with bars on them right? We have more jail and prison beds than we have hospital beds. These 130 facilities are scattered across the state. And so a person may be 4 to 5 hours from their family, right? Doing their time in a jail, which does not have the type of outdoor access, right? May not have the same types of mental health care that we might need, right? So these differences matter, and they matter in Louisiana. All right. And they're secret. You know, and it's not just prisons that are secret, it's jails that are secret too. And this is by design. We see that there is deference to the administrators of these jails and prisons. That is law created deference, meaning if someone comes into court with a complaint that says, you know, this was wrong, I was harmed, right? I need you, court, to fix it. What that means is the judge will say, well, you know, we got to defer to the administrative and correctional expertise of the warden. So if they say it's okay and can't be fixed, well, then I guess that's what we think too, right? And so there's lots of ways in which rights, not only for the people who are incarcerated, but for others, all of us, in fact, who are impacted by incarceration, are also denied related rights. So there's no right for a child to go visit their parent in a jail or a prison, right? There's no right of a journalist to interview a person who is in jail or prison in order to get more information about what's happening inside of there. And then internally, they are denied the right to organize, to petition, to associate, and to collectively express needs. Right. And so one of the reasons that prisons and jails are the focus of my work is because it is a place where the power differential is so great. It is so broad. And so that, you know, thinking about how the law works inside of these spaces where the power is so disparate, I think tells us a lot about who we are as a society, and what we actually stand for as a people. So I want to first talk about multi-billing. Y'all might know this more by its name, the habitual offender law. And that title is just wrong for so many different reasons, right? So one, you know, people are rarely just offenders, right? We are offending mothers, offending fathers. We are people who have experienced our own trauma. We are people who have assisted one another. So I call it, and many others call it, the multi-bill. And what it essentially does is it creates a mandatory minimum when you're on your second or later criminal involvement, right? So some of you might know it by the 3 strikes and you're out game, right? But here in Louisiana, it doesn't do 3 strikes and you're out. So basically you, and in fact, there's kind of a series of schedules there that you can see on the slide. You're convicted of a crime, and then within 5 years of the end of your sentence for that crime, or the end of supervision, right, for that crime, if you're involved in anything else, that next felony, whatever it may be, will then bring you within the ambit of the multi-bill statute. Now, Nia Weeks told us about the role of the district attorney and how much power is present there. And we see that in the multi-bill. And I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute. Okay, so we see how it plays out as a mathematical matter. I just want to show you what it might look like, right? So carjacking, which is a relatively common crime that we see in Louisiana, sentencing range of 2 years to 20 years maximum, which is new and part of the reform. I just want to be really clear. It used to be 2 to 99. And so this 20-year maximum is the improvement. It is the reform. Now, second offense, what that means is that 2 to 20 becomes 10 to 40. For that third offense, it would be 13.2 years to 40 years. And if it's your fourth offense, it's 20 years to life. Now, some of y'all are going to remember the stories of Fairway Bryant, right? We've got the hedge clipper case. All of these are felonies. Now, put to the side that if it is a sex offense or a violent offense, all of these penalties are actually worse. We are assuming that this isn't a sex or violent offense. This is the lowest you could get. Then think about the fact that it could be any felony, right? Because really what you're thinking about in terms of felonies is more the time period during which the crime occurs rather than the actual type of crime. And so, we end up with these crazy scenarios where somebody's doing life for possession of a joint, right? And you might go, well, that's crazy. How did that happen? Well, maybe they got caught smoking weed 4 times in a row. That can lead to that is a theoretical and may in fact be an actual circumstance. So the multi-bill is one of those objectively neutral things, right? None of these laws say anything about Black folks, right? And yet, what we know is that the racial disparities are all over this, which I am coming to. We just need to set the scene straight. So the other thing is, I started talking a little bit about this, but think about what types of crimes, right? And so this pie chart here that you see shows you that for currently, so this is as of September 2020, people who have been convicted of a crime and who are currently behind bars. What does that mean? It means that for their offense that triggered the multi-bill, 45% was deemed to be a violent crime. 22% got a multi-bill based off of a drug offense, right? 16% got a multi-bill off of a property offense. And so what I want you to think about is, well, is it every single crime that's bad, right? And think about where these laws came from. And I hope that you're not surprised when I tell you in Louisiana, this too is tied to our infamous 1898 Constitutional Convention. That same Constitutional Convention that adopted non-unanimous juries for the state of Louisiana, that same Constitutional Convention that in its opening, whose the goal of the conference, as written by the reporters, was to maintain the supremacy of the white race in Louisiana. So when we look at what's happening with the multi-bill, we see that over half of the people are completing sentences of 20 years to life. All of that, and I know you're not surprised by this one. So first, we know that in Louisiana, and this was something that Nia Weeks opened to us with, Black folks are essentially 1/3 of the state population. They are essentially 2/3 of the prison population. Then, if we just look at the multi-bill population, they are actually 77% of those who are currently incarcerated pursuant to a multi-bill. And this is driven by just a few parishes. So it is 4 parishes in particular, and over 50% of the people who are multi-billed are coming out of Orleans and the district and Jefferson Parish. Again, the role of the district attorney, the discretion of the district attorney, and the ways in which that happens. But even where someone does not, even where a parish does not use it all that often, right? Because we know that most people who are using them are using it in those 4 parishes. Not a single parish in our state has a 1-to-1 ratio when we think of a black to white ratio or likelihood of being sentenced under habitual offender. Not a single parish. Moreover, even where it's not routinely used, so for example, in Lafayette, they don't tend to use it a lot. But guess what happens when they do use it and who they use it against? right? So in Lafayette, the black to white ratio is 19-1, even though they don't use it all that often. But when they do, it is their vehicle of choice, right? The lowest that you could possibly get with is 4-1. And so what we see is we have this objectively neutral rule that one doubles down on all of the different ways in which race enters our system, the ways that the two speakers before me really laid out in expert terms. And then two, we add additional areas and voices of discretion just on that item, enlarging the disparity beyond what we see in other spaces. All right, so with that in mind, that's just one example. I want to turn to this other example, which is forced labor, and was the has been a part of my work since I started in the academy. My very first paper was on this, and it was about the 13th Amendment and thinking about what does it mean to be a slave. And it came because a person that I was visiting in prison was really upset about, he was at Angola, and he was really upset. And he said, well, why do they get to make me a slave again? And I said, you know, that's a real good question. Let me, let me go research that, right? And so, you know, we know this 13th Amendment language. I mean, we have to thank Ava DuVernay and her team and work for really vaulting this into popular conversation, this exception. But this is also a picture of Angola from 2009. And that's what field labor looks like in Angola, right? And I have a whole separate slideshow that we could see that documents what slavery has looked like, and then penal plantations, which are an iteration from our history of slavery, right? So when we're thinking about race and structural justice, I want us to also keep in mind that some of these systems were in fact built originally during slavery times, and their repercussions can still be seen today. There's all types of work, and in fact, Louisiana, they put them to work. Technically, we have prison enterprises, industrial enterprises, which I want to tell you every year loses money. Every year, it always comes up in the red. And yet, this is a huge part of how our system operates and is able to operate. Our jails and prisons would not be able to function without forced mandatory labor from the people who are incarcerated. They run the facility, from the kitchen to the cleaning to the maintenance. There is no way that they could function without it. In addition, these are all the things that that they can be forced to do while inside. But what I really want to talk about a little bit is some of this field and agricultural and row crops, right? Because if you didn't know, they still plant cotton at Angola. They did skip a year. I think it was in 2013. It's about an acre. They don't plant that much, but they still plant it, and it is still picked by hand. When we talk about plantations, we also want to talk about row crops, right? And so we have, in fact, Loyola students have given me redacted copies from their clients of disciplinary reports for not filling their quota in terms of their cotton bags were too heavy, or they didn't pick enough soybeans, and they would get disciplined for that. But let's also just talk about one of the more clear signals when we talk about forced labor, and that's incentive wages. First, statute says it's objectively neutral. It says the Secretary of Corrections will set it, okay? Secretary of Corrections sets it in the administrative code. Then you look and you see, wait a minute, you don't always get incentive wages. You get it when you choose not to earn good time. Good time is a way of getting home sooner. So already we're forcing people into these crazy choices. And it does in almost like, you know, this language that allows up to 4 cents an hour of a raise annually. But remember, on the back end, if you find this other buried provision, they're usually capped at $1 total. And on the right-hand side, I'm giving you a sense of what people earn, right? 2 cents an hour for picking cotton. I want to be real clear about that. That is the punishment thing that is working cell blocks. It is also where a good large number of people are, or people who are incarcerated are forced to labor because they don't have the capacity to provide jobs in all of the other areas. And here you can get a flavor of some of the other types of labor. So just a couple more points, and I know that we're all running a little bit late. And so I just want to say, first, I want you to understand what these wages actually mean. Not only are those wages just as a dignitary matter insulting, right? But I also want you to think about what it means for the equivalency rate. So they have to pay a $3 copay for medical services. They won't technically be denied services if they can't make the copay, but the copay will be debited from their inmate account. A $3 copay means $543, right? If we were to actually put it in real terms, what that means for them per hour. And so I wanted you to get a sense of both the wages, but also how much they don't correspond even to the environment that they live in. I want you to understand that incarcerated labor and that forced labor is unprotected. So it is unpaid, it is not voluntary, and it is also exempt from the normal protections that we provide for labor in the broader world, including they're not considered employees for the Fair Labor Standards Act. The traditional remedies for tort are blocked by the Prison Litigation Reform Act. And even with workman's comp, for federal prisons, they have an alternative workman's comp situation just for incarcerated people. But in fact, many states also block that from the state program. So what does that mean? That means we have to be creative. I've already shared how some reforms have been enacted, and you may not have found those to be significant. And that's an important critique. But I leave these jumpsuit pictures up here for me, and the bags. I mean, there are thousands of jumpsuits there waiting to be filled. And I just want to be really clear that it is, while abolition is an important goal and rethinking how we do things is an important goal, we also have to realize that there will always be someone that we as a society consider to be the most despised. And we are not going to be able to get everybody home at once, but we need to make sure that there is harm reduction for the people who will inevitably be forced to stay in. At the same time, we don't want to build systems where people, this is the underside of a bunk and a calendar that they were keeping out of toothpaste because that is what they were able to draw with. At the same time, you know, we shouldn't have calendars of toothpaste on undersides of bunks, right? Reform is not enough. And we need to think about how abolition fits into that project. We may think about it as abolishing the multi-bill statute, each sentence served on its own term, or abolishing the forced labor that we impose on tens of thousands of people a day here in Louisiana. So thank you so much for giving me the chance and opportunity to talk and think about these two things in this context. And of course, any questions or answers, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much. One thing I want to kind of point out, I think that ties everything nicely together, is that you know, we started and we've referenced how we're the most incarcerating state and the most incarcerating country in the world, and at least Louisiana in the field of youth incarceration has actually made a lot of improvement. So when I started practicing, we were the #1 state also in youth incarceration, and now we are middle of the pack, which is normally not anything to be proud of, but I am actually super proud of the progress we've made, you know, in that field, and not just the numbers, but in the conditions and the treatment models and things like that. And so we have a number of questions, and some of them could be, you know, the subjects of their own symposium. So I just want to open it up to whoever kind of wants to answer. And you know, in light of things like, other things like the prison industrial complex, the way that we run not just our private prisons, but for-profit systems of courts, of how we fund law enforcement and things like that. I think those tie into the themes that Professor Armstrong was talking about, and the tension between kind of abolition and defunding versus, we need to, we've heard some really good recommendations, about how we need to elect officials that share the same vision, like district attorneys and the progressive DA movement, which has recently come to New Orleans, and so there, there's a lot of solutions, large and small, but the problems are so kind of enormous. What's the right approach, or what's the most effective approach, or what's the thing that we can do easy? Is it just kind of everything at once, or is there a total different track we need to take? In the next 5 minutes, please answer fully.
I think it's an all and, one thing that, we showed even today is each of us understands all the things that each one of us, and we support each other in each of our spaces, but we each have a very direct lane that we navigate with all the information and understanding all the spaces. And so I think it is an all-in approach in figuring out where you fit in the model and where you want your advocacy time and resources to go. I'll also say at the core of everything is disseminating racism. I know that you all had Dr. Andre Perry on earlier, and he always says, ain't nothing wrong with Black folks that fixing racism won't solve. And that is real. And so, we think about all the systems and how systemic racism imparts itself, and being against systemic racism is not just in your head and in your heart. It's like, oh, I know that's wrong. It's being an active participant consistently, checking self consistently. There are many spaces where I am an ally, a community ally, that I do not navigate myself. And so when I have privilege in those spaces. And so I have to, enact my privilege in ways to support communities that I'm not a part of all the time, even checking myself and being disappointed in self when I fall short as well.
There's so much to say. I think, Nia, you are absolutely right about this. It's all and. It's a multifaceted approach. And I always say when I get asked this question, everybody can do one thing, right? So first of all, for those of us who are inside the system working actively, we got a lot to do. We got to do it all. But for those folks who are watching from the sidelines and the criminal legal system, the juvenile legal system may not be your thing, you still have a role to play, right? By paying attention to who the elected officials are, showing up and giving a voice in legislative and agency regulation, rulemaking, and the like. So I think that's really critical. I think two things I'll say. Just one of the questions that was asked, what is the number one or the single thing that educators can do to bring about change? And I have to say, it's hard to pick just one thing, but if I had to limit myself to one thing, I would say it would be insisting upon the reinvestment of resources from police, and metal detectors into youth-based services. So social emotional learning. Actually, let me, instead of giving you these fancy words, trust me when I say there are evidence-based strategies for ensuring youth well-being. Look at the research. There are people who know this. And so as an educator, your goal has to be to insist upon the reallocation of funding from law enforcement responses to public health well-being responses. And that brings me to the second thing and last thing that I'll say is there's a question here and a global question that's been presented about abolition. And Professor Armstrong, you talked about it in the prison context. In the policing context, people always ask, well, should we abolish policing? Here's what I say in response to that. I get the appeal of abolition, but at the same time, if we think more clearly about the reallocation of resources and reallocation of responsibility, right? Police officers will tell you in a heartbeat, they don't want to play the role of mental health counselor. They don't want to play the role of disciplinarian in school. So if we can just as a community let go of our age-old notions that police officers are the catch-all, right? And that they can do everything and be everything, and that 911 is for everything. If we could get rid of that and just narrow the focus of what police officers are uniquely trained and needed to do, and then every other, which is a really small amount, right? And then everything else, we can reallocate those resources to be better used, and to find people who can serve our young people, for example, all of us better in the ways that we need them to. So.
Yeah, and I you know, to add on, I think in my experience where we have seen change, and I think it's instructive to think about our history, right? Sometimes things seem impossible because of where we're sitting, but man, to read the ways in which victories have been won over time is inspiring, and reminds me that sometimes we sit in this moment and all we see are really tall walls. And I just fundamentally think that that's not the right approach. I think that change is slow. It is incremental. I think it is not always a straight line forward. I think sometimes we take one step forward and two steps back, but that second step to the back might be a side jig, right? And so I think it takes lots of different hands. I don't think that there's ever a single person where we say that's the person who changed the world. And so because of that, I think what Nia said, you know, I tend to think of it as both and. She says all and, but it is from a variety of perspectives. And what you're thinking about is creating pressure and tension on the weakest points of systems, because that's how you deconstruct systems. And that's a all hands on deck type of approach. That's just my theory of change, but it also underlines everything that I do.
So I really look forward to continuing both this conversation and this work with all three of you in different ways outside of the symposium, and just feel really fortunate to have been a part of this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Linares. Thank you to all of our speakers. We're going to have about a 10-minute break, and then we're going to finish up with our last panel that is going to be New Orleans specific, and we hope that you can stay and join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank y'all so much.
You know that.